titled Applying Access Management at the Local Level, Examples from the Great Lakes Region. So we'll be able to see some practices that are discussed during this conference in action in the field. Presenters today are Brad Strader, leader of the Transportation Planning Studio for MKSK in their Detroit office. That's correct? He's been involved in over 200 transportation projects and over 70 corridor access management plans and codes. Recently completed his term on the TRB Access Management Committee. And we also have Chuck Wade, Chief of the Planning Section at the Wisconsin Department of Transportation, whose group is responsible for maintenance and update of the statewide systems planning data. He's previously worked for a regional planning commission in New Hampshire and as a consultant in Wisconsin. And his expertise is in access management, highway and rail corridor studies, and NEPA compatible environmental project documents. So with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks. So I'm going to kind of cover broadly the Great Lakes region and what makes maybe the Great Lakes, including Wisconsin, different from some of the other states that do access management. And a couple examples from Ohio and Michigan and some general comments, and then Chuck's going to take us through a case study that's Wisconsin specific. So this is kind of our outline. As I just said, Great Lakes comparison, and then just a few examples. Chuck and I had fun working with the Wisconsin DOT. We helped put together the access management training program for Wisconsin DOT a couple years ago, and that's how we got to know each other. So in the Great Lakes, there's more home rule, more communities. I mentioned during the lightning round, if you recall, that in like in Oregon and Colorado, there are maybe 250 or so municipalities that can have jurisdiction over the roads, plus the counties, and then the Oregon and Colorado DOT. In Virginia, even less, like I think 147 cities and towns or something, and the DOT controls most of the right-of-way in the state of Virginia. I've done access management work in Virginia and South Carolina and ordinances in Texas and Alaska. The Great Lakes is very different. So in the Great Lakes, there's much more home rule, many more jurisdictions that have some type of authority, zoning or road design authority. And so rather than DOT and county and maybe a few cities, you have a lot of shared authority. So this is just a chart of some typical, like what are some 10 typical techniques used in access management, both preventative and planning in advance and dealing with design and so forth. Things like retrofitting poorly designed access systems. Well, it's kind of the DOT often leads it, or the county, but the municipality has a shared role. In a lot of cases, in some of the Great Lakes states, the MPO is usually the group that leads sort of retrofit projects. So it's a little bit different in the Great Lakes region where we are. Another difference of the Great Lakes region compared to some of those other areas, in addition to home rule emphasis and the number of municipalities, is in recent times much more of an emphasis on redevelopment, maybe relaxing standards, being development friendly. In the state of Ohio, the state of Michigan, the economic development organizations at the state and county level get very involved in transportation. Some of them believe access management is bad for business, and the staff within the state agencies or the municipalities sort of fight access standards. So there's maybe a little bit more ease of implementing access management outside the Great Lakes, I think, than in the Great Lakes because of that. A lot more laws have been passed with property owner rights, and the courts have not been generally very supportive of access management as they have been. When I look at Wisconsin's maybe a little bit different, working with Drew and John Sobotek, but when you look at cases in Florida and Colorado and other places, more of a burden is put on the agency or municipal governments in the Great Lakes region to demonstrate access management specific to that situation, and much more frequent awarding of compensation to developers, even if it doesn't seem to many of us as being warranted. So a quick comparison, Wisconsin, of the states I'm familiar with in the Great Lakes, has the most assertive access management. This Trans 233 that Drew just talked about, something that's not common in the other states. In Wisconsin, they have, I think it's 1,500 miles of restricted access roads where it's very limited access. The state will purchase access rights and so forth, so very assertive. Minnesota is a little bit more like Wisconsin, but in Indiana, Michigan, and Ohio, much more lax regulation and support in the courts and locally for access management than you find elsewhere in the country, and Wisconsin's probably the leader. In Ohio, a lot of the access management work is at the county level, so about half the counties have their own access management plan and codes. And in Ohio, the MPOs, especially AMATs out of Akron, MORPC out of Columbus, NOACA out of Cleveland, sort of Columbus, and the MPOs in the northern part of Ohio are very involved in access management planning, working with local units of government to put together access management plans or corridor redevelopment plans. Not so much in the Cincinnati area, but few cities in Ohio have access management standards. Again, some of this is the pressure for redevelopment, or they developed years ago. They still rely on their subdivision ordinances that are generally very outdated, often not updated. Indiana, most of the access management is done by the Indiana DOT. There are some counties that have access management standards in their development codes or in their engineering specs. And in the Indianapolis area and northern part of Indiana, some of the MPOs have been involved in access management. Again, kind of like southern Ohio, southern Indiana, access management is a little bit of a lighter touch. In Michigan, the MDOT has some basic standards, but they've generally looked at the local units of government to regulate access through their zoning. Some counties, but we have 83 counties in Michigan, only 2 I'm aware of have access management standards in their county review. So it's not that strong. Michigan had a fairly assertive access management program and training and kind of pulled the plug on it back about 10 years ago. So access management at the DOT level has been pretty light, and it's really left up to the MPOs and the cities and townships. In Michigan, we have cities, villages, townships, counties, and states, so it's very complex. And the townships, unlike in Ohio and Indiana, townships have zoning authority if they choose to have it. So we have like 1,870 levels of zoning in Michigan. So even, I think, more complicated than Wisconsin. I think there's 1,940 or something in Wisconsin, including the counties, so we're well over that in Michigan. So some of the things we find in the Great Lakes region that is somewhat common in other places, but very pronounced in the Great Lakes, is this issue of who controls access decisions. So in the middle of this drawing is the right-of-way. So the DOT or the county or the city controls the right-of-way, and they may have access permits or they may not. Cities and villages often don't even grant permits in some of the states, Ohio and Michigan. And then the local unit of government, again, all these townships in Michigan, in Ohio it's the cities and counties, have zoning authority and site plan review. And so sometimes the standards aren't coordinated. Sometimes the DOT will grant an access permit that's contrary to the site plan approval by the local unit of government. So in the Great Lakes region, it's really important to kind of get a shared authority. This is where that first chart, shared authority, and have consistency in standards and communication between the agency that's in charge of the right-of-way and the agency that approves the site plans along the right-of-way. So things that need to be coordinated would be ordinances and standards or engineering standards. When there's lot splits, to get the DOT or the county to give input on the lot splits to make sure we're not creating a future access complicated access because of lot splits being approved. New development site plans, changes in use, which is complicated because you need to be, again, in the Great Lakes region, you need to be sort of practical on redevelopment and how much traffic is being added by the change of use, what's the worst access points, but maybe not always the pure approach of by the book will work on some of these retrofit corridors. And then review of traffic impact studies. Traffic impact studies are hit and miss in the Great Lakes region, I would say. Wisconsin DOT has standards for them. Some of us heard yesterday Minnesota has standards for them. In Ohio and Indiana and Michigan, it's more at the local level or at the county level. The information isn't always shared. Sometimes the DOT doesn't even know a traffic impact study was required. The ITE is updating the best practice or recommended practice for transportation impact assessments. I'm a vice chair of that committee, and we're looking to add in freight, transit, pedestrian and bicycle elements. And so if any of you work with traffic impact studies or are interested in this next publication of the ITE recommended practice, please let me know, because we're looking for volunteers to give us ideas on best practices and things to address in the new manual. So again, traffic impact studies are sort of hit and miss in the Great Lakes region in many of the states. This is one slide from Ohio. Ohio, as I said, the county level is probably the most assertive access management. ODOT does have some access management standards that's sort of a by the book and follows on the state trunk lines. but most of the roads in Ohio are not state roads, and many of them are county roads. So about a third to half of the counties have some type of access management standard. The state tried to put some financial requirement on the counties to get certain funding. You had to have an access management code. I've worked with a couple of counties up in the Akron and Canton area. I thought Summit County around Akron was pretty interesting because they wanted to have access management standards based on context or land use. So they have a lot of variation. There's actually a national park, Cuyahoga Falls National Parks in that county. A lot of variation in terms of context. Rural areas, semi-rural, suburban growing, suburban declining, suburban stable, small towns, big cities, a relatively big city of Akron. And so rather than just coming up with access management standards for the county-controlled roads, they didn't want a lot of variations, so they worked early to get the cities, villages involved with the goal of coming up with a model ordinance and having the townships, cities, and villages all adopt the same standards as the county, so there'd be some consistency, and that a stakeholder committee of attorneys and developers and the major design professionals who work for developers to get their input and making compromises and getting the education out there so that everybody would be sort of on the same page with access management, training their officials, training staff, and Summit County has a refresher course. So the idea is people quickly fade what they've taught in, hopefully you will remember everything that you learned here, but other people besides you, it kind of fades quickly when they get back to their day-to-day. So at Summit County, they try to do a refresher course every year or two for the officials and staff on what's going on in access management and how to apply it, including their own staff, because their staff changes, their positions change, their responsibilities change, so they do training with them. Also in Summit and Stark County, which is next door, they tie access management to traffic studies and require the traffic impact studies to evaluate access options and their consequences on the roadway system and focus on safety. So in Michigan, there is a manual on traffic impact studies, but it doesn't really talk about safety. In Ohio, safety is a major component of the traffic studies. And they also, in Ohio, especially for redevelopment, offer incentives to property owners to implement access management. So the county will agree to help pay for or fully pay shutting down the driveways when there's a reuse, or they'll offer developers incentives that if they're going and doing a roadway project and you'll participate and agree to close driveways, it'll be totally covered by the project cost. And they'll say, but if you don't want to participate, that's your choice. But if later you come in to change use or expand, you're going to have to make all the improvements on your own, and that might cost you $30,000 or $40,000 or $50,000. You might have to move a utility pole. But if you'll participate in our project and close access, then the county will fully pay for it. So they get a lot of interest that way. They also have business development districts in Ohio and business development districts that have tax increment financing and other things. They will actually go in and close driveways and implement access management because they view it as a positive benefit on the business district and for safety. So Ohio, not probably as strong as Wisconsin and Minnesota, but probably the third place in access management in the Great Lakes. Some of the things they really promote in the Ohio at the county level is really working with the local communities. Again, Ohio has a lot of different jurisdictions like Michigan, and getting them to look at their subdivision regulations and land use planning and master planning, comprehensive planning and zoning to try to limit access points, have pedestrian systems connect, have connectivity within developments to limit access points along the major roadways. And then site plan approval, since that's done at the local level, what Ohio with a lot of the counties have done with their codes, trying to get the townships and cities and villages to adopt the same code or reference the county code. And it has early communication with the county. Same works with ODOT, so when a developer has a concept or a site plan that the DOT or the county is alerted and gets a chance to give early input on the site plan, maybe work out the differences, and that hopefully the standards the county uses are applied by the township, or the township will have, or city or village will have the same standards in their zoning ordinance. So that's one of the main things Michigan has tried to do, but not probably as effectively as Ohio, is having the local units of government alert the DOT or the county that controls the right-of-way and have site plan review standards are consistent, and having the local unit of government sort of look ahead when they're approving lot splits or something just on the corner. Oh, we don't have any plans for the parent parcel, to make sure that there's an overall access management plan for the whole parcel, at least a concept, before they'll approve a lot split or the first site plan. And then another thing I think within Indiana and Michigan, and maybe not quite as much in Ohio, is what is access management. And because of some of the tension of economic development and maybe a lack of support at the upper level on access management, there's been more focus on management and maybe not perfection or not maybe strict adherence to the standards, but that on case by case, trying to look at the situation and coming up with what's the best solution. So it may be really working to avoid offsets or driveways in the functional area of the intersection, but maybe not as much push on driveway spacing on the same side of the road. I think that in the Great Lakes, there's probably not enough support or push for alternative access systems, frontage roads, backage roads, service drives, some of the deep throat design, some of those type of things that in a lot of states are very just common in access management, and just by nature, that's what's done, and developers are used to it. It's a harder thing to get accomplished in Michigan and Indiana and Ohio. So just a couple examples of access management. This is Boyne City. Boyne City is kind of a rural example, much like a lot of Wisconsin, sort of in a resorty area. If you know where Traverse City, Michigan is, it's up in that northwestern part of the Lower Peninsula. And this is a case like a lot of cases in Michigan where there was no access management by the DOT. The DOT didn't really have any access management guidelines even until the year 2000. So access is just kind of everywhere. Cities, villages, townships, counties, and the state really had no standards other than geometric standards. So this is a pretty common thing in the rural or semi-rural areas of Michigan, especially in the Detroit area, the Lansing area, and then northern Michigan. And then the MPO or the state or the county goes in and tries to solve the access problem once there's congestion and a lot of crashes. Well, come and fix our problem, because the problem was created over generations when there were no standards. So we really try to prevent this now with standards, but going in and retrofitting. So this is an example. This is M75, which is a state route up in Boyne, and access management was just one of many parts of a project. This project was actually funded by the Michigan Economic Development Corporation. They have a redevelopment ready community program that's really encouraging redevelopment of the cities and towns in Michigan, and they've actually, because some of us have been involved with that, become supportive. Initially they were sort of opposed to access management. Now they've become supportive once they realize the benefits of revitalization to pedestrians, bikes, reducing crashes, preserving flow, kind of training them, teaching them the benefits. This isn't an anti-business aspect. This is pro-business. This is, pro-safety. And so these were some of the many goals for M75, because it's more of a comprehensive corridor plan. In Michigan now and Indiana, access management is usually, and Ohio too, tied to a roadway design project, maybe looking at complete streets or road diets or other things, and access management is a part of a project rather than a separate access management plan. So the results of these kind of plans come up with some of the illustrations like we saw earlier in this session. How do the buildings change over time? How does the roadway change? How do you put in pedestrian crossings and sidewalks and bike facilities? Where should parking be? And that access management and connecting driveways is just a component of these more comprehensive corridor plans. I think, as we saw in the first part of the session, the power of graphics and simple graphics. I think when Frank said people remember 80% of the graphics, 20% of what they read and 10% of what they hear is about right. So these are some, I think, examples of how access management changes over time, and also the power of graphics. So this is a project in the Lansing area that 20 years ago, one of my access management projects was for this corridor. This is M43 that runs from Lansing to the east through Michigan State University's campus in East Lansing. And we came up with an access management plan, limiting driveways, having frontage roads, and so forth. And it's worked pretty well over time. But now this township, to remain viable, wants to have redevelopment. They want to have buildings closer to the road, mixed uses, and so forth. So very much changing from a very conventional suburb to more of an urban type suburb. And so this is the existing condition. You can see the frontage roads along both sides of the road. And we were asked to figure out, well, how do we get these frontage roads to adapt to the new vision for the township, but still provide that access management function? So the idea here is, as new development is coming in, what happens to these service drives? So we're keeping the service drives, but we're changing them to be more like slip roads or access roads, so they're paralleling the road, but we're going to allow on-street parking, bike lanes, so that the conflicts are not going to be out on the main road, but the service drives that currently just serve as a connection between businesses and limiting the number of driveways, they're now going to accommodate parking, bicycles, sidewalks along there, building the buildings up close. So having those service drives has been great for this township, and now they're just going to sort of repurpose them. They'll still provide the access function, but they're going to provide other benefits as well. And so we put these illustrations together. These were done by Dover Cole, who's on our team out of Miami, just showing the transition over time, how the service drives will be adapted, and eventually this could be a bus rapid transit corridor in the future. I'm also working in Detroit on the Detroit Downtown Mobility, Parking, and Access Plan, and I had never done an access management aspect in a major city like Detroit before, and what I've confronted is very different than access management in places like the slides I just showed and Chuck will talk about. So what is access management in Detroit? Detroit is fortunate now to be kind of on the rebound and lots of cranes and development going on. We used to have level of service A about 10 years ago because there was nothing going on, and now we actually have congestion, and I think even the DOT is coming around to thinking congestion is a good thing. We don't want to go back to level of service A when all the buildings were empty. So what is access management in Detroit? Well, one of the things is we have a lot of parking lots. The parking lots have wide open driveways, so pedestrians have to walk along the front. Cars are used to going in and out. When the economy was bad, people got used to no regulation. The city had no permits for access or anything else, and now we're trying to tighten up those driveways to the parking lots and putting them on certain streets, not on other streets, and so forth. So that's one aspect. Another aspect is parking structures. So some of the main congestion in Detroit, the streets downtown, the volumes are actually pretty low, but we have a lot of congestion because we have a lot of short signal spacing, but also we have a lot of big parking decks, and people queue up at the parking decks. So most of the AM and PM peak hour congestion is queuing at parking structures. The city has no permit. They have very outdated technology. They just use the road to stack up. So we're working with the city to come up with a new annual permitting process that will fine the operators of the parking structure if they're queuing out into the street and causing congestion and safety problems. Politically, this is kind of a tough thing. I'm not sure we're going to get full support of the mayor. We showed some illustrations. We use like Revit and other software. We showed some illustrations to the mayor a couple weeks ago, and he said, that doesn't look like Detroit. Some of these beautiful graphics don't look enough like Detroit. He didn't understand the graphics and so forth. So I think what Frank said, you need to make sure the graphics are simple. You need to orient the audience. Sometimes we assume they can figure out east, west, what the roads are. You really need to, don't assume that everybody's going to understand an illustration. But that's some of the access management challenges in Detroit. It was anything goes in the past. Mark talked yesterday about curbside management. That's a big thing in access management in Detroit. We have lots of valet. People don't like to walk in Detroit. They got used to valets. Almost every block has valets. So we have parking structures and valets and double and triple parking. All those things that were talked about yesterday, that's part of the access management program in Detroit now, is trying to manage the curb, manage activities, and get the parking structure operators to change their equipment so that the queuing is inside the structure, not coming out onto the street. A couple other things we've learned, I think, in the Great Lakes District. A lot of the work, again, at the local level is going to be corridor specific. So if it's zoning, we work with a lot of communities that use overlay zoning. Some of the terminology that Drew just talked about practical difficulty, unnecessary hardship, and so forth. All those things on zoning, I do a lot of zoning work. And the idea of an overlay district is all the rights of land uses and setbacks under the current zoning remain, but you come up with special standards that apply to this corridor. And that's been one of the more successful techniques in the Great Lakes for access management. Say, regardless, we're not going to change your zoning, but we're going to add a new layer of standards that is access management on top of them. So that upper illustration on the right sort of shows that. The other thing is, has been talked about at a couple sessions, is when you're doing preventative access management and thinking ahead to use the standards and have good standards and apply them, but then trying to figure out sometimes those pure standards don't work on a retrofit corridor, and to come up with what is the best solution. So this does take more time. It takes engineering judgment. We have a problem with some of the DOTs with a lot of turnover, more of a by-the-book approach and not a lot of experience in access management. So I think understanding access management and when and how to make engineering judgments is important. Working with the communities to understand all the various aspects of site plan review and how they relate to access management, the consequences of what you decide on each individual site plan, how it affects the roadway is important. So some of the lessons I guess I would take out of some of my experiences when working with officials and developers attorneys, because I do a lot of that, is focusing on the safety benefits. Even developers and developer attorneys, when you show some of the charts we see here at the conference on the safety benefits, they'll come around. Sometimes they're an easier audience to convince than some of the elected officials, frankly. Using simple graphics, Frank talked about simple graphics to show how things are. I learned my lesson with the mayor of Detroit a couple weeks ago when we had just beautiful renderings. He didn't understand them, too complicated. So making sure that the graphics are simple, people understand, avoiding jargon like the jargon we talk about, functional area and level of service and operations, put it in terms people will understand so they don't think you're being condescending or they don't get it. So simple graphics, simple terms is important. Showing examples locally is really important. So you can show access management lessons from Colorado and Oregon and Florida, but if you're working in Ohio, you better have some examples from the Cincinnati area or Canton or Steubenville. So having some good local examples and data is important. And then some of the simple things are just simple graphics again. I used this somewhere in the session earlier today, but how four corners aren't the same, and rather than graphics of functional area and so forth, just simple graphics to show, you know, at two corners, a left in is going to cause a lot more conflict than the other two corners. Oh yeah, I get it. And photos of in their town, if here's a car making a maneuver, like the photos we saw or the video we saw yesterday, some of us of the Starbucks here in Wisconsin. Those type of graphics are very convincing for the officials to use. Safety, again, is the most compelling topic. Training is really essential. The Michigan DOT spent a lot of time about 7-8 years ago did training programs all around the state and with their staff, and then the training stopped. Almost all those officials are gone. Many of the staff are gone at the state level, at the local unit government level, and most of them have forgotten or never knew what access management was. So training is really important, and then refresher courses and getting that information out over and over. There has to be a commitment to do that. I think Wisconsin DOT is really putting an emphasis on that. I would say the other states in the Great Lakes have not done that very well compared to Wisconsin. Business community, don't being afraid of the business community, but going to the Chambers of Commerce and Urban Land Institute could be a big supporter if you explain them to the benefits, working with the major developers, getting some support, having them advocate and say they understand access management. I thought it was great that we had the gentleman yesterday who does the convenience stores and gas stations talk about access management, coming up with solutions. Having people like that at this conference and being supportive is a great way to get the officials to be on board at all levels, state government and county and local. And then explaining that you've got some differences of flexibility of rural, suburban, and urban, but you also have to get the community officials to be thinking longer term. Even the permit staff just thinks, well, this isn't going to be a big deal, just this permit, but really thinking ahead. Bob Fasek here at WisDOT has really, I think, hit on something. He said, you just keep hammering, you got to think ahead. What are going to be the consequences of this short-term decision? I try to do that a lot when I'm doing comprehensive plans. You got to look longer term. You can't just focus on the future. That's really important to get people to think longer term. The residents, the public, they are not going to think longer term very often, but developers may, and you can get your officials to think long term if you give them the right tools and the right story. And then showing and looking for implementation opportunities. So in the Great Lakes, as I mentioned, site plan review, usually done at the local level, don't have things like Trans 233, they have in Wisconsin. So site plan review standards for new development, standards for redevelopment, maybe showing how over time you gradually get rid of the worst access point. Maybe the next generation of that land, you should get rid of another access point or rebuild in service drives, but show them incrementally how access management gets implemented. Trying to integrate access management recommendations as part of road reconstruction standards, looking for incentives or other organizations to help close driveways. Sometimes just showing businesses, wow, you can gain a lot of parking if you close some of these driveways. So I've spent a lot of time in a lot of the projects in Ohio and Michigan. You almost like walk business to business, explain what you're trying to do, go out there in the field with them and show things, hear their perception, their truck maneuvers, what they need to do, and show that you're flexible and listening rather than say, we're just going to close 3 or 4 driveways because it's going to be safer. So just come in and here's what we're trying to do, here's the benefits, what do you think, and work it with them. It takes more time, but you're going to get more support and get backed up by your elected officials. And then communication, I think in the Great Lakes, really working to get training at all levels, staff levels, DOT staff levels, DOT administration, elected officials, the development community, and then refreshers on training, and then also having a good communication system. So whoever intakes that first application, whether it be at the township, city, village, county, or at the DOT, that they're communicating with the other decision makers so that there's collaboration and agreement and problem solving, so the developer is not getting the community or municipality and their officials to be pitted against the DOT, to work together on a solution and avoid those kind of conflicts. So we talk about conflict management and access management. I think part of it is avoiding conflicts in the communication at the different levels of government by having good communication protocols up front. So that's kind of some of my experience across the Great Lakes. Going to turn it over to Chuck to talk about applications in a specific Wisconsin corridor.
Thanks, Brad. I'm going to do this one a little differently, seeing as this is an National Access Management Conference. I'm going to wrap up this presentation with a case study. Brad's handing out some worksheets to you. I wanted to try a little micro exercise just to see, as a transportation planner, you're kind of a jack of all trades, master of none, right? Well, this is a classic corridor preservation study or classic corridor study that we did. Access was a strong component of it. I just want to see, with the expertise in the room, if we did the right thing or not, and how you guys might come up with. So what I'm going to do is, Brad's handing out some worksheets. I'm going to give you kind of the background information, the context. We'll do a little 5-minute exercise, and we'll have a few of you maybe jump out, see what jumps out at you, and I'll kind of show you what we came up with as part of the study. I'm going to preface the Highway 33 study by saying that it has not been constructed yet. The study was completed in 2016, and right now it was just in the media. They're looking at some of the designs of the corridor now, so it's kind of in that phase of the process. But Highway 33 is located in Baraboo, Wisconsin. It's about an hour north of here, almost due north. It's bounded by 90-94 interstate, kind of on the north side. Wisconsin Dells, this is the southern part of Wisconsin Dells here. US Highway 12 that you see kind of running through the western edge of the village is actually, they just finished a bypass corridor. So it's a freeway standards actually there, a bypass corridor that was constructed. But we still anticipate the east-west traffic because of the connections to 94 are pretty strong. So they still anticipate, even though there is a bypass affecting north-south, there'll still be a fair amount of traffic going through. Where I'm going to focus today is on the city and village of Baraboo. The village is on the west side and the city's kind of more of the eastern piece. It's about a population of about 13,000, but I'll go into some more slides here. Tier 2B, all that really means is it's kind of a 4-lane corridor with a lot of great access through it. So the reason we did this study, the overall was safety, but the data collection, we wanted to gather all sorts of factors, everything from environmental, social, basically your classic study to look at future transportation the next 20 years. What can we do to maintain the existing facility for as long as possible, anticipating land use and growth changes, and access was a huge piece of that. So we start our studies, I always like to start my studies with needs identification, go out to the community, kind of identify what the local needs are, and then develop kind of throughout the process long-term strategies and recommendations. And so part of this, one of those long-term strategies was kind of an access management vision for the 20 years as the city were to transition. So the existing conditions, it's a 4-lane highway, urban roadway basically with 4 10-foot wide lanes. There are no bike facilities currently on it. It wasn't really a consideration when it was first constructed through there and expanded. It's got 5 to 5.5 foot wide terraces for separating pedestrians, 4 to 5 foot wide sidewalks, so substandard there, and posted speeds through the corridor pretty much 25 miles an hour, but they kind of vary in a few spots. Just here's some pictures of kind of your classic urban environment as land uses transition over time, where you might have some driveways that are located, right in the turning radius of the intersection. Some areas still have some beam guard that are right next to the curbs, that type of thing. Sidewalks that are right next and maybe elevated, no curb ramps, that type of thing. And so kind of goes through predominantly residential, very good grid system. So housing here was constructed in 1900s, 1920s, and in the 1950s. So houses are pretty close to the highway corridor too. Just some characteristics. Between Highway 12 and County T is kind of our western boundary, or our eastern boundary. There are 27 public road connections. So that pretty dense street grid there. And 136 private driveways within 2.5 miles. So a high number of driveways, very kind of classic condition. Access points per mile comes out to about 65.2 just based on that calculation. So they experience both urban and rural access environments. So you've got some of the neighborhoods, some of the residential housing still located on the street, influx of realtor agents and things that have bought houses. There's some commercial operations there on the far west side. They've got big box retailers, that type of thing. The village of Baraboo has, your convenience stores, fast food, that type of thing. So a lot of mix of uses. In terms of the existing traffic, it used to have a pretty high trend in traffic in the early 2000s. It's pretty stable now. So it's 11,000 roughly, and it's projected to kind of stay in the 11 to 13,000. So that's kind of, and that's considering that bypass corridor. It's expected to be about that range. And looking at the crash history, it's approaching. It's exceeding the statewide crash history, but it's important to note that 71% of all the public road intersections experienced crashes over the 5-year history that I looked at. So even a lot of them are stop controlled. There's a few signals on the corridor, but a lot of the public road connections experience crashes. Not exceeding crash severity, injury, but approaching it, basically low speed corridor, but definitely exceeding what we'd expect on similar highways. One thing I'll leave you before we go to the exercise, the village of West Baraboo actually has a highway corridor zoning overlay district. And so when future development comes in, they have to consider cross-access agreements, driveway spacing, and things of that nature. So they have that actually ordinance in place. So with that, I'd like to take a few minutes for you guys to look at the sheet that's in front of you. And I'll put the map up here as well. We'll take 5 minutes to review kind of the segment map that you're given. You can use that to make notes on, that type of thing, not critical. But what we're going to do after that is we're going to have the mic come around, and if something really is jumping out at you, as I've done this in other cities, I know what the solution is to this. I kind of want to hear that. And we'll take 1 or 2 of those. He's got the answer ready.
No, it's just the cross-section. It's hard to see. Is the cross-section all paint, or is it raised in any manner? Just a 4-lane?
It's all paint.
4-lane paint.
Yep. Yep. And so we'll take a few minutes to take a look at that, and then I'll have Brad or our facilitator walk around, give you some time, and then I'll show you what we kind of came up with as part of the study process.
I guess while they're reviewing, a quick question as far as the crash information. Do you know what the predominant crash type was? A lot of rear ends or angle crashes? Or
A lot of both.
a lot of both?
Yeah, a lot of rear end collisions, a lot of right turn rear ends, a lot of angle, a lot of rear ends in the corridor. Yeah. There were some left turnouts.
Pretty much a 35 mile an hour.
25 to 30 mile an hour, yeah.
25 to 30.
All right, give you 1 or 2 more minutes. There is a couple gas stations, and on this particular map I gave you, you'll notice there's offset public road connections as well as a gas station.
If you have any thoughts, I can come around and give you the mic. All right, here you go.
On my short list,
Yep.
I would definitely look for hotspots first. And in detail, I wouldn't just look at numbers in a table. I would pick up 5 years of accident history, officer reports, Because you get down the detail, you find things like I had one where, oh, everyone was queued up, but they signaled me, they said, oh, just cut in front of me, like through the queue, and we had all these left turn accidents on the far side of the queue, and you wouldn't have seen that unless you looked at the accident report where the woman who had caused the accident said, oh, they waved me through the queue, so I went, and I hit on the far side. So it's really important to see where your hot spots are. Otherwise, so if you have a really high accident history on hot spots, you might look at a roundabout, but they're expensive. So I wouldn't do it unless you hit the price. I would just recommend as a cross-section, just bike lane, through lane, two-way left turn lane, and bike lane as a cross-section. And then start to work out the issues where the left turn offset is in the wrong direction. And that would be my next priority.
Okay, all right. Anybody else have anything different that he came up with that they'd like to share? Steve?
How open is the municipality to shutting off public roads?
So in this particular municipality, I'll say they have a very good parallel streets grid system. So their issue, number one issue, because of the residential and the schools in the area, was pedestrian safety in terms of crossing the corridor and along the corridor, no bike facilities, those type of things. So some interest and some opportunity because of that good parallel street system.
Because there's a number of them here that it looks like, well, especially Barker Street, just looking at the spacing between, your regular public roads, and with that offset with those left turns facing each other, that would be, I would look to try to close that connection completely, definitely.
Let's maybe take one more, and then we can I'll kind of show you what we kind of came up with. Yeah.
Since pedestrian safety is a big issue, definitely would start to look at, are there opportunities to close some of these driveways by negotiating with the individual property owners and improve the sidewalk system and also the pedestrian crossings across this road? And also, there was a bypass, did I hear you?
There's a north-south bypass on the far west side, but doesn't really impact the traffic on this corridor.
But so the traffic isn't really growing in this area, so you do have right-of-way to work with. You could even, and not knowing what the long-term land use plan is in this area, if they're thinking about density in the future, they could be thinking about a much more complete street design concept for the whole corridor, a cycle track, improved accessibility to the schools, and that sort of thing.
Those are all issues that they raised. Okay, so thanks for that. I'm going to kind of come up with what we came up with the study findings. So that's your point spot on in terms of what we came up with the strategy recommendations, because the traffic volume is in that 12 to 13,000. And anticipated looking 20 years out, it did lend itself very well to a 3-lane section. So 2 11-foot lanes, being able to get in there, 5-foot wide bike lanes on both sides, which is what the community would want to have. You're able to get those sidewalks at 6 feet with very minimal strip acquisition along the corridor. So the big important part is able to do a retrofit, and we're not needing to tear down half the neighborhood to put an improvement in place. And additional lighting and signage. So we did go with the 3-lane with the twiddle. The other opportunity that provided, which I'll talk about a little bit down the road, some of the other recommendations we looked at in terms of the access side is consolidation. And one of the things that's hard is you have residential, narrow lots, close frontage, that type of thing. You can't go in there and deal with individual accesses necessarily. But they had a good parallel alleyway system from the older housing stock that was in there, and a lot of the garages in there were detached. So there might be some opportunities to shift some of that access to the rear. Those are some challenges, obviously, with that. But looking at that consolidation, a transitioning corridor, so we see more commercial trying to move into the corridor as those developers come in, kind of what the West Village or the West Baraboo did in terms of the overlay, looking to consolidate those, looking to push that back if they're going to go deep in their lots they're purchasing, to go back to the roadways behind, that type of thing.
When they did the overlay to help control the change in use,
Yes.
was there pushback from the residential owners who saw commercial value?
I'll do that again. On the overlay district, restricted what they could do with their property and, or, you know, make it more difficult. Was there pushback to, from the property owners saying we object to the overlay district, it's a taking, we can't go commercial?
That was in place before we started the study, so.
So you didn't do it, the city did it?
The city had that in place ahead of time.
Oh.
And that part, that's good to note, that part already is pretty much a lot of commercial already in that piece of the corridor. So the residential's more on the city of Baraboo side, so I don't expect they had a lot of kickback. I think they were reacting to a situation they already had ongoing over time. Okay. Just to wrap up, I talked about consolidating driveways. Jefferson Street is on your map. There's a school on Jefferson, you did note correctly, that's an offset intersection. And so those left turns there do create, as Brad showed in his slides, that issue, but it also created where the pedestrian walkway was there. They have a pedestrian crosswalk on one side of the roadway because of that offset, because that's the only safe place to put that to allow, so that, because they're looking at traffic trying to make those left turns, if we put the pedestrian crosswalk on the other side, so their solution was to not create the direct path where the pedestrians are going, but to push that crossing over where there are no pedestrians. So to fix that, shifting that roadway, making it a four-leg intersection was one of the recommendations that we did. Now they can put good crosswalks on both sides that are more directly tied to where the pedestrians are actually moving on the corridor. And closing one of the roads like Barker Street was one of the recommendations as well as part of that. So the other nice thing that it allowed us to do with the three-lane cross-section is it allows us to close off some of those offset that are kind of in misalignment, those offset intersections. Put more of a median type treatment through the middle using that center area. And that way we don't have to purchase additional right-of-way in the corridor to treat those intersections. And so that was one of the core things we did there as well. And with,
You got an isolated raised median.
yep, in certain locations. So some of the busier intersections, right, we have the left turns, and you got to provide the left turn bay, that type of thing. Luckily, where a lot of the offset ones were local stop-controlled streets that were distance away from those intersections where you could do something like that type of treatment.
Yeah, it makes it twiddle and dedicated.
Yep. All right. And additional recommendations, obviously, just classic access management recommendations, realign driveways across from one another for those commercial driveways. Remove driveways from the upstream and downstream functional areas. We had a lot of driveways located in the intersection functional area. Use medians at offset intersections, as I discussed already. Ensure adequate spacing of public road connections based on their functional class. New local roads were also recommended, more on the peripheries. And then cross-access between adjacent parcels. So they had a development plan they were working on in tandem with this, which was later on in process on the western part, but just looking at that flow of, can you provide a local streets connectivity system so that we don't need driveways, we can use one good intersection to provide, and then more internal circulation, that type of thing. So with that, I guess Brad and I are open to questions.
I'll grab you that microphone here. Got about 4 minutes.
Did the new law that you can't condemn for bike lanes impact your design at all?
That came, Act 59 actually came in place in the last budget cycle. This was completed in 16 in terms of the study. So that is a good question. Drew's in the room, but I'm not going to put him on the spot for that particular subject. There's a question on whether or not sidewalks are underneath that restriction or not. So it didn't impact this specific study. But looking forward, it'll be interesting to see when they do their solutions what kind of ultimately comes out of it as part of that.
Got time for maybe one or two more, if anyone else?
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the local overlay district and how that benefited this project and whether you think that has broader application across the state as a planning tool.
I think it's a great tool to have in place. I think based on my specific study that I was doing, it didn't have a huge impact on what I was doing. I definitely promoted having that in place. I think with the two communities being parallel to each other and bringing them to the table at the same time, so it's a lot of time the studies that I work with are interjurisdictional. It's not just one community. For the city of the Baraboo to see that the village had something in place and to be able to talk about that tool, I think was maybe the benefit of what the study brought there, that maybe they hadn't necessarily looked too closely at that. But in terms of the actual overlay, I think it's an awesome tool to use. My particular study was focused on mitigating the existing conditions and looking in the future. So it didn't really focus too much on that ordinance, but I think it's a really solid tool.
Okay, and one more up here.
I can talk to you and ask on the side later, but are there particular variations between Minnesota and the other Great Lakes states that you could speak to? I don't have any specific question. Just curious about Minnesota in general.
So disappoint you in my answer. So my knowledge of Minnesota's access management was all learned yesterday in the session on Minnesota. So I'm not, my firm, we're doing a comprehensive plan for Shakopee, which is in the Minneapolis area. And so we're just getting into that. So I'm not that familiar. Rod, was that his name yesterday, from Minnesota? He'd probably be a better person, if you didn't see his session, a better person to ask. But they, and it would be in the program, so you can look at that presentation if you didn't see yesterday about their access management program. I think it's chapter 5 out of the manual. They do have traffic impact studies is in within the access management, which Wisconsin sort of has and the other states don't. So that I think would be one distinction in Minnesota. Another distinction seemed to be a lot more emphasis on pedestrian and bike, at least from the presentation yesterday. And the planners I know in Minnesota and work with tool design out of their Minnesota or Minneapolis office, and I'd say in the Great Lakes region, Minnesota puts more emphasis on transit pedestrian bikes than most of the other states do.
Right up against lunch here, so thank you very much.